Okay then. Welcome back everybody. We're just going to jump right in. My name is Jeffrey. We're going to be talking about some common economics questions and that people have had, and going over the answers, and then reviewing some of the answers that a previous tutor has written for these questions. I've taken a cursory look at some of these questions, but I have not seen the solution, so I'll be doing this just along at the same time as you guys, and hopefully this will be a kind of a good, helpful coverage of some of these microeconomics and macroeconomics concepts. The first question we have says that asks us to consider the relative liquidity of the following assets. Right. So this one is the question is written a little bit poorly, but I believe it says consider the relative liquidity of the following assets. Number one is the funds in a money market account. Number two, a $20 bill. Three, a bond issued by a political trade company. Four, your car. Select for your car, and then select the assets in order of their liquidity from the most liquid to the least liquid. So the thing we have to know here is what is the definition of liquidity, right? And basically, liquidity refers to how quickly you can convert an asset into cash, because cash is the most liquid form of money. And so the more steps or the longer it takes for an asset to convert to cash once you've started that process, the less liquid it is. And on the other hand, the quicker it becomes cash, the more liquid it is. So given a $20 bill, a money market account, a bond issued by a political trade company, or I think it might be publicly traded company, or your car, the first clear answer is going to be $20 bill is the most liquid, because $20 bill is already money, and so that's the most liquid money. That's the most liquid asset you could have. The second would most likely be a money market account, because that's something like a savings account, and so it might take a day or two to process any withdrawal. But other than that, it's not too long of a process. The third might be a bond issued by a political trade company, because there are some uh, there's like some like a process to go through in order to sell a bond or into redeem a bond from a publicly traded company, and so that's not something that you can do right away, and so that'll take a little bit longer than it would take to withdraw money from a money market account. And then finally, your car is an asset, right? It's worth money, but to go through the process of posting an ad, selling the car to a willing buyer, delivering the car, exchanging the money for the car, that's going to take a longer period of time in order to do that relative to the other three types of assets. And so we most likely say the most liquid is going to be the $20 bill. The second most liquid is going to be the money market account. The third most liquid is going to be a bond issued by a a publicly traded company, and the fourth most liquid is going to be your car. So hopefully, kind of both the definition of liquidity and how we've applied it to these problems is going to be fairly obvious here. Okay, so let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. So the previous tutor said the most liquid, the least liquid, $20 bill, money market account, a bond, in your car. Great, so we get the same order as them. And their explanation is that liquidity means how quickly an asset can be converted into cash. Perfect. Cash or currency can be used immediately, so a $20 bill is the most liquid exchange, right? Not a liquid asset. The funds in a money market account must be withdrawn within a day or two, so it is the second most liquid asset, right? A broker can sell a bond issued by a publicly traded company within a short period of time, and it may take a few days to receive cash. That's right. And finally, a car you own is the least liquid of the assets, because it may take weeks or even months to find a buyer and get your cash. Right. Yeah. So I think this is a great answer. It covers the definition of liquidity and also gives a good explanation for each of these answer choices and why we've placed them in the order that we have. Great. Oops. Great solution. And so on to the next one. So this problem says, when inflation is blank, the Fed aims to slow the economy. So the Fed is the Federal Reserve, and it's the kind of body that regulates the money supply and monetary policy. And so if the Fed is aiming to slow the economy, what that really refers to is contractionary monetary policy, right? And so we would attempt contractionary monetary policy if we had a expansionary gap, right? And so let's take a look at the dynamic ADAS model. And so this is where we really see contractionary and expansionary policy coming into play. So we have our long-term aggregate demand, long-term aggregate supply, and then we have our short-term aggregate supply. Oh, sorry, this is aggregate demand, and then this is short-run aggregate supply. And so in this scenario, we have the short-run GDP is greater than long-run potential GDP. So we have this. This is our expansionary gap, right? And so this is a period of time in which the Fed would hope to engage in contractionary monetary policy in order to reduce the rate of growth of the economy. And so the question asks, however, when inflation is basically high or low, right? And so we have to look at price levels here, and we can see that at the long run, we would see that when the inflation rate is high, that's when we would really see a expansionary gap because with a long run equilibrium, we might see something like this, where you have all three lines intersecting at the same point. However, and that will give us a price of P star. However, with high aggregate demand in the economy growing too fast, we see we are actually at P1, which has, oh, sorry, this is drawn at the wrong level. Let's try that one more time. P1. P1 is where we are right now, and that we can see that the price levels are higher than they would be at long-run equilibrium, and so that would define what inflation is, which is higher prices overall. And so the Federal Reserve is going to want to slow down the economy when we have a the Federal Reserve is going to want to slow down the economy when we have an expansionary gap, and that is defined by high inflation due to larger than long-runly possible aggregate demand. And so the Federal Reserve is going to aim to slow down the economy in that scenario when inflation is high. So let's take a look at the explanation given by the previous tutor. The previous tutor says, the Federal Reserve aims to slow down the economy by adopting a contractionary monetary policy when the inflation rate is high. So that's exactly what we've depicted on the graph. The increase in aggregate demand leads to an increase in prices, which reduces the purchasing power of the currency. When the inflation rate becomes aggressive, the Federal Reserve attempts to decrease the money supply, which reduces the spending capacity of the consumers and brings the aggregate demand down. That moderates the inflation rate. It decreases the money supply either by increasing the interest rate or selling government securities and bonds under open market operations. So I think the previous tutor did a good job covering the essentials for what we see on the graph, and also explained a little bit about the entire process by which the Fed would go about trying to slow down the economy or go about engaging in contractionary monetary policy. So that's really good. We're going to clarify that this can be seen on the aggregate demand supply graph. This is observed on the dynamic ADAS model with the expansionary gap scenario. Otherwise, great answer, right? So otherwise, we have no problem with that. I just felt like it was important to note that if in terms of looking at this from a graphical standpoint, we want to look at this model over here. Okay, let's take a look at the next question. All right, so I think we have several here. So let's take a look. The first question says the determinants of price elasticity of demand. Consider some determinants of the price elasticity of demand. Number one, the availability of close substitutes. Number two, whether the good is a necessity or a luxury. Number three, how broadly you define the market. And number four, the time horizon being considered. A good without any close substitute is likely to have relatively inelastic or elastic demand, since consumers cannot easily switch to a substitute good if the price of the good rises. So here we are really looking at elasticity, I think, for this question. I think for the next few questions. And so what we have to keep in mind is what exactly is the definition of price elasticity, right? And so it essentially tells us the responsiveness of demand, of quantity demanded to changes in price. It's given by the following equation. Elasticity is equal to percentage change in quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price. And so if we change price by a little bit, how much can we expect quantity demanded to change? And so then the next question is, what are kind of like the metrics of what is considered elastic or inelastic? Essentially, anything with elasticity less than 1 is going to be considered inelastic. Anything with elasticity greater than 1 is going to be considered elastic. Inelastic simply means that when price changes, the quantity demanded changes relatively less. So it's less. So demand is less responsive to price changes than we would expect normally. Whereas elastic demand is referring to the opposite scenario where quantity demanded is more responsive to price changes than we would normally expect to be the case. And so with those two definitions in mind, we can take a look at this first question again. It says, a good without any close substitutes is likely to have relatively inelastic or elastic demand since consumers cannot easily switch to a substitute good if the price of the good rises. And so this sounds like a scenario where consumers are basically almost stuck purchasing a certain good because even if the price rises, there are very few other things they can buy to substitute for this good, right? So we're kind of stuck buying this good no matter what. And so that seems like a scenario that's going to be more suited towards inelastic demand, which is a scenario where, again, price has relatively low effect on quantity demanded. And so that's going to be the answer choice we choose due to that lack of substitute goods. And that is generally the case when we are talking about substitutes and elasticity of demand. The next question says, and let's check the answer for that on the bottom to make sure that we also got the same answer as the previous tutor. Right, and so the first question, inelastic demand, when there is no close substitutes, consumers find it hard to replace and have to still buy even if the price is high. Right, so that's the same rationale that we just talked about. Let's take a look at number 2. A good's price elasticity of demand depends in part on how necessary it is relative to other goods. If the following goods are priced approximately the same, which one has the least elastic demand? And so this is going to that question of necessity, and it gives us two options, a diamond necklace or an amputation procedure for diabetes sufferers. So the question asks us for which one of us has the least elastic demand, aka the most inelastic demand. And so we're looking for which one of these would a price change not really have an effect on the quantity demanded. And we would most likely say that for diamond necklaces, maybe there's elastic demand, maybe there's inelastic demand, depending on what the price is. For B, amputation procedures for diabetes sufferers, that's going to be something that we would say definitely has inelastic demand. And the reason for that is because these are some procedures that are incredibly necessary, and so price is unlikely to have a significant impact on how much demand there is for these procedures, right? You can think of a scenario in which you could raise the price by 200%, and for many of these diabetes sufferers, they would still probably demand the amputation procedures that are being offered because they're necessary for continuing to live. And so that would be something that we consider to have very inelastic demand, and so we would probably pick amputation procedures over diamond necklaces for a good that is the least elastic. And that would be the correct answer there. So let's take a look at the answer choice that the previous tutor gave. So previous tutor also said amputation procedures for diabetes sufferers, and said that has the least elastic demand. This is because someone who's suffering from diabetes has no option to follow the medication and the related procedure, no matter how expensive it may be if one needs to be cured. However, diamonds have an elastic demand because they're considered a luxury good, and the demand would fall with a rise in price. Yeah, so I think that's pretty good. I would it's demand is going to follow the rise in price for uh, you know for amputation procedures for diabetes patients as well, but it's just going to fall less. And so, just want to make that one distinction. The law of demand tells us that if price rises, quantities demanded goes down, but relatively speaking, the reduction in quantity demand is very little. And in the case that you have perfectly inelastic demand, then it actually wouldn't go down at all. So that would be the answer to number two. So then let's talk about number three, the price elasticity of a good. Price elasticity of demand for a good also depends on how you define the good. Organize the goods found in the following table by indicating which is likely to have the most elastic demand, which is likely to have the least elastic demand, and which will have demand that falls in between. And we have three categories. We have food, red bell peppers, and vegetables. Most elastic in between, least elastic. And so this is going to that question of how broadly we categorize a good. And so the more broadly we categorize a good, the less elastic it becomes, because you're asking people to basically price or give up more and more, a larger range of things when you have a broad category than a small range. And so it'll be hard to find substitutes for very broad range goods when it's compared to finding substitutes for very specifically narrow range goods. So let's look at food, for example. So among food, out of our categories of red bell peppers, vegetables, and food, food is going to be the broadest category, and that would make it the least elastic. And we can think of an example for this. There is no substitute really for food in terms of the need it fulfills, and so it's gonna by even the same rationale as the first two things we talked about, which were um, necessity and what was the other one? Uh, Close substitutes. Food has very few close substitutes and is also very necessary. And so, by that logic, by defining this very broad category, we make this the least elastic category. The second thing we'll talk about real quickly is vegetables. And so it's a little bit narrower than food, but more broad than red bell peppers. And so we'll probably say it's in between in terms of elasticity. Because when we go to the third option, which is red bell peppers, this is a very specific and narrow category of food. And so it's going to have a lot of substitutes. You can think of green bell peppers or yellow bell peppers as substitutes, and it's also going to be not that necessary. We don't need to eat red bell peppers the way we need to eat food, and so that's going to make it the most elastic in terms of a price change would probably let us pick a lot of other things rather than just red bell peppers, and so that's going to be the most elastic. So let's take a look at the answer given by the tutor. Food would be categorized as the least elastic because it has no close substitute. Vegetable elasticity is in between, as you can find substitutes for vegetables like fruits. Red bell peppers have the most elastic because of close substitutes like green and yellow bell peppers. Great. So exact same things that we talked about before. So no problems with that. And finally, the last question says the price elasticity of demand is also affected by the given time horizon. If the price of gasoline is relatively high for a long time, consumers are more likely to buy more fuel-efficient cars or switch to alternatives like public transportation. Therefore, the demand for gasoline is A, less, B, more, C, no more nor less elastic in the short run than in the long run. So this is going to that last factor or determinant of elasticity, which talks about time horizon. And so what we're seeing there is that this question of how does having a short run versus a long run horizon affect how elastic something is, and the explanation in the beginning already breaks down that in the long run consumers have more time to adjust their long-term behavior, like buying a new car or switching their daily habits. And so given more time, all things are more elastic because you give consumers more time to adjust, to find substitutes, or to make lifestyle changes that make a good less necessary in their daily lives. And so, generally speaking, we would think in the long run, goods are more elastic, and in the specific case of gasoline, we also think that in the long run, goods are more elastic. So in the short run, they would be less elastic. So that would be A. Let's take a look at the answer choice. 4 says less elastic. With the passage of time, new technologies develop and more substitutes are available in the long run. Thus, the demand becomes relatively elastic in the long run. However, in the short run, there are less or no close substitutes available, and the demand becomes relatively inelastic. And so I'll just clarify really quickly that there's also this idea of like giving consumers more time to adjust. Also, in the long run, consumers are given more time to adjust their behavior or find they said more find more substitutes for the good, which makes demand more elastic. Okay, and otherwise that would be the correct answer here. All right, so let's move on to the next question. Specialization and trade are closely linked to blank. So generally speaking, like I would think that this would be a multiple choice answer, but it's not entirely impossible for this to be a fill in the blank. Specialization and trade are both very closely discussed when we talk about the production possibilities frontier and specifically about the idea of comparative advantage. And so comparative advantages, if we think back to our two good model, is basically saying which country can produce our two goods, can produce one good at a lower opportunity cost than another country can. And so again, you assume there's only two countries and there's only two goods. So which country can produce a good with less costs? And so if a country has a comparative advantage in producing good X, then and that would definitely mean that the other country has a comparative advantage in producing the other good, which is good Y. Then each country should specialize and produce only the good that they have a comparative advantage in, and then trade in order to get the optimal basket of goods for both those countries in order to reach a consumption bundle that is outside the PPF. Both of these things are close linked to this idea of comparative advantage. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. So the previous tutor says the benefit of comparative advantage, which is great. And they said, in an economic model, the countries that benefit from a comparative advantage have a comparatively low level of opportunity cost over others in the production of a particular product. This benefit increases the level of economic efficiency and the potential output of an economy. For instance, most oil-producing nations have a lower level of opportunity cost in producing chemicals over others. The level of specialization and the available resources are the two main factors that can easily influence the economic efficiency of an economy. The benefits of a comparative advantage show the least amount of losses and the ability of a country to produce specific goods and services. So, right, and so I think the explanation that this tutor gives is really good, but it focuses more so on, it seems to attribute all of the benefits of comparative advantage to specialization without bringing in the key component of trade. Because if each country were to just specialize but trade was there's a barrier to trade, then it would actually not be in the interest of the country to do that, because even though they could produce the good that they're producing at a lower opportunity cost, most countries want a balance or a bundle that incorporates both goods. And if they specialize in one, then they can't get the other good without trade. And so we're going to add in a little bit of definition here about trade. So we're going to say trade, it's important to also keep in mind that specialization and trade go hand in hand. Countries should specialize in the production of goods in which they enjoy a comparative advantage, but must trade in order to exceed their domestic potential output and achieve the consumption bundle that would favor that would be the most economically efficient. Okay, and so other than that, if we include that definition and incorporate this idea of trade, then this is a great answer. And so we have no really other major issues with the way that this was written. So the next question says, which of the following best describes monetary policy? Sorry, describes a monetary policy tool. And so the options are tax rate, B, government spending, C, reserve requirements, or D, all of the above. And so tax rate and government spending are going to be two ways that the government can influence the growth of the economy for sure, but they do not fall under monetary policy because remember, we think of monetary policy as tools used by the Fed to control the money supply in order to influence economic growth. What tax rate and government spending fall under is fiscal monetary policy. And so fiscal policy. So these are both fiscal policy tools, and the primary way that the government, in terms of Congress, would go about, or like the executive branch would go about trying to influence the economy, but not the Fed. So it's not going to be 1, 2, or 4 because all of the above is eliminated by eliminating 1 and 2. And so the third is reserve requirement, and that is going to be a monetary policy tool. And we can think about the reserve requirement as the tool that is, again, going hand in hand with the multiplier effect. And it's basically saying how much does the Fed require banks to keep in reserves for is a percentage of deposits. And so we know that if banks, the more money that banks loan out, then the higher the multiplier is, right? And so, multiplier is given by 1 divided by the reserve requirement. So the more multiplier there is, the larger the money supply. And so if we increase the reserve requirement, what we're really doing is decreasing the multiplier, decreasing the amount of loans circulating in the economy, and therefore decreasing the money supply. And so that is one way in which the Fed is going to go about, decreasing the money supply available in the economy, or vice versa by decreasing the reserve requirement and increasing the money supply. So we know that 3 is going to be the right answer here. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. They say number 3, reserve requirement, which is good. And they said, the monetary policy of the economy is controlled and implemented by its central bank, which involves interest rates and credit management to influence the economic activity, maximize employment, and stabilize the financial system. The 3 monetary policy instruments are open market operations, changing the discount rate, and changing reserve requirements. Changing the reserve requirement influences the amount of money that banks can lend, which leads to changes in the money supply. Making changes to a tax rate and government spending are instruments of fiscal policy. Yeah, I think that covers all the bases. Why the other answers are incorrect, and what specifically reserve requirement does. And so we'll add in that link between reserve requirement and money supply. Just to be super thorough, specifically, the reserve requirement is used to calculate the money multiplier given by 1 divided by R. As a result, increasing the reserve requirement decreases the multiplier, which decreases the money circulating in the economy. On the other hand, decreasing the money multiplier, decreasing the reserve requirement increases the money multiplier, which increases the money circulating in the economy. Yep, so that last link is going to be just an extra bit of detail, and otherwise we should be fine. Okay, so let's take a look at this. I think this is a series of questions here. And so it says, this is all about unemployment, and number 1 says, a person who is not employed and claims to be trying hard to find a job, but really is not trying to find a job. A is counted as out of the labor force, but should be counted as unemployed. B is counted as unemployed, but should be counted as out of a labor force. C is correctly counted as out of the labor force, or D is correctly counted as unemployed. And so this goes into the kind of distinction between unemployed versus employed and labor force versus not in the labor force. So the way we can think of this is that uh, within a certain population, we have the employed, let's say, and the unemployed, and then this is the labor force, and then we have another segment of the population which is excluded from the labor force, so not in the labor force. And so what are the definitions then for someone who is in the labor force? So someone who is in the labor force is someone who is capable of working, so they don't have a disability or anything that stops them from working, and B, has been looking for a job in the last 4 weeks. And so anybody who falls into those two categories is considered in the labor force, and is then, in terms of employed or unemployed, if they have a job, they're employed, or if they don't have a job, and if they don't have a job, they're unemployed. And so looking at the answer choices, we see a person who is not employed and claims to be trying to find a job, but really is not trying hard to find a job. So if they claim to be trying hard to find a job, maybe they are submitting paperwork or submitting for unemployment benefits saying that they are in fact trying to find a job and have been trying to find a job in the last 4 weeks, that would make them unemployed rather than not in the labor force. But if they're not really actually trying to find a job, then they're in reality not in the labor force because they're not trying to find a job in the last 4 weeks. And so what we would be looking for is the answer that says that this person is miscategorized as someone who is unemployed when they should be considered someone who is out of the labor force. So that would be closest to answer choice B. This person is counted as unemployed but should be counted as out of the labor force. And so hopefully that kind of thought process there makes sense. And let's take a look at what the answer is that the previous tutor gave. So previous tutor says C is correctly counted as out of labor force. Unemployed to be counted as unemployed. A person must have a job but be actively looking for one. So I'm gonna push back on the answer because I believe what the question is implying when they say that this person claims to be trying hard to find a job is that they are submitting to the government that they are trying to find a job, and so the government is going to categorize them as unemployed. And so I would say A is correct. The question notes that this person is claiming to be trying hard to find a job, which would lead us to assume that the government, that he is telling the government that he has been looking for a job. This would lead to him being characterized as unemployed rather than as out of the labor force. So that was going to be the correct answer there. So we're going to push back on question 1's answer here. Let's take a look at number 2. Data on the unemployment rate in the United States since 1960 shows that the unemployment rate is A, always 0, B, sometimes 0, C, rarely 0, and D, never 0. And so this is kind of a misconception, I think, publicly that the unemployment rate, a natural rate of unemployment rate is 0, when in fact the case is that the natural rate of unemployment has hovered around like 4.9% for like a long time, and then variations from that are due to the business cycle. And so, we're going to say that it's never 0, and so D is going to be the right answer here. And this is just kind of historical data from recall that we're going to have to just remember in order to get this answer right. So 2, D says never 0, which is great. So that's the right answer. 3 says if the natural rate of unemployment is 5.2% and the actual rate of unemployment is 5.7%, then by definition there is A, cyclical unemployment amounting to 0.5% of the labor force, B, frictional unemployment amounting to 0.5%, C, structural unemployment amounting to 0.5%, or D, surge unemployment amounting to 0.5%. And so now we're getting into kind of the details of the different classifications of unemployment, or the different causes for unemployment, right? So different reasons that someone might be unemployed. And so the first thing we need to do is distinguish between what is the natural rate and the actual rate. So natural rate of unemployment is given as a sum of two of the three types of unemployment, and those two are frictional and structural unemployment. So if we add up frictional and structural, we get natural, and that's always around 4.9 to 5 point something percent, right? And then we have the actual rate of unemployment, and that is given by the natural rate of unemployment plus cyclical unemployment. And so unemployment related to the business cycle. And so that means overall, if we break it down to its subcomponents, the actual rate of unemployment is the sum of all three types of unemployment, which is cyclical, frictional, and structural unemployment. And so if the actual rate of unemployment is given by the natural rate of unemployment plus cyclical unemployment, then actual rate of unemployment minus natural rate of unemployment gives us cyclical unemployment, which is 5.7 minus 5.2 equal to 0.5%, and that would be what is equivalent to cyclical unemployment in the economy. So we're going to look at answer choice A as the right answer here, because again, the difference between natural rate and actual rate of unemployment is going to be cyclical unemployment. So let's take a look at the answer that given by the previous tutor. They say 3. Cyclical unemployment amounting to 0.5% of the labor force, which is correct. And so we're going to be all okay with that answer. Number 4 says unemployment that results because it takes time for workers to search for jobs that best suit their tastes and skills is called which of the following? And so this is going to be, again, testing our knowledge of the definitions of the categories of unemployment. And we're going to say that this is the definition that we're given is for frictional unemployment, which is defined exactly as that, the time it takes for workers to search for jobs that best suit their taste and skills. And the way we can think of this is that let's say there's 100 people looking for jobs and there's exactly 100 jobs. Even if there are 100 jobs, even if there are exactly the number of jobs as there are the number of people available, where hypothetically then everybody should have a job at all times, there's still going to be a certain level of unemployment because of people shuffling around, taking the time to find a job that is best suited for their particular tastes and skills. And so that type of unemployment that doesn't result from a lack of jobs, but just results from the shuffling process or the search process is going to be defined as frictional unemployment. So let's take a look at number 4. The question, the previous tutor says number 4, D, frictional unemployment, which is correct, and that's great. So we have no issues with that. Number 5, unemployment that results because the number of jobs available in some labor markets may be insufficient to give a job to everybody who wants one is called which of the following? And so this is another category of unemployment, and again, we just have to know the definition here, and it breaks the mold for what we said was the case of frictional unemployment, where we said, we could have the same number of jobs as people, but we would still have unemployment. This is saying there's not enough jobs for a number of people. There's not enough jobs going around for the number of people looking for them, and so that is going to be what we call structural unemployment. That the structure of the economy prevents a certain number of people from getting jobs, and so that's going to be the right answer here, C, structural unemployment. And there's several reasons we talk about for structural unemployment. Some people say minimum wage, some people say efficiency wages, other people say, unions. And so, all those things are things that you can keep in mind when we think about structural unemployment. Basically, things in the economy that prevent there being enough jobs. And so 5, previous tutor says C, structural unemployment, which is good. And so we have no issues with that. Number 6. Frictional unemployment results from which of the following? A, job searching. It is often thought to explain for relatively short spells of unemployment. B, job searching explaining relatively long spells of unemployment. C, a surplus in some labor markets explaining short spells of unemployment. Or D, a surplus in some labor markets explaining relatively long spells of unemployment. And so we kind of went over this in question 4, but frictional unemployment again refers to that job searching pairing process. So we're going to eliminate C and D and just choose between A and B. And then in terms of how long the unemployment lasts, again, we said that it's most likely to be short term because it's just a process of looking for a right job. We can think it might take 3 to 4 months for someone to find the right job, but it's not going to take 1 to 2 years for them to find the right job, right? And so the job searching unemployment is relatively short term, and in that sense, frictional unemployment does not indicate anything wrong with the economy, and so that is something that we would just pick A for. And the previous tutor says A, job searching, explaining relatively short spells of unemployment, which is good. Taking a look at number 7, it says frictional unemployment is A, not inevitable, rather it can be reduced to zero by well-designed public policies. B, not inevitable, rather it can be reduced to zero if by the elimination of unemployment insurance. C says inevitable because at any given time jobs are being created in some firms and destroyed in other firms. D says inevitable because in some industries wages are always set above the level that brings supply and demand into equilibrium. So actually, I want to go over all these answer choices because even if some of them are 3 of them are incorrect, they do bring up important things to know about frictional unemployment. So A says it's not inevitable because it can be reduced to zero by well-designed public policies. And so while frictional unemployment is inevitable, and one of the answer choices gives the exact reason why, it can't be reduced to zero. Well-designed public policies can reduce frictional unemployment because it would reduce the time it takes for people to go through the job search process. So you can think of centralized government sponsored job posting boards like the USA Jobs or USAJobs.gov or something like that is like the board for government jobs or public policy that makes it a lot easier for people to know what jobs are out there. Public policy will be able to reduce frictional unemployment, but just not to zero. But there is a relationship there that is important to know. So it's not going to be A, but B says the same relationship, not inevitable, and can be reduced to zero, which we know is not the case. But it talks about eliminating unemployment insurance. And so if we eliminated unemployment insurance, that would also reduce frictional unemployment most likely, because what unemployment insurance does is it provides it provides money to people who don't have a job or are going through a job search process. And in that sense, it reduces the motivation that people would feel to find a job for them, right? Because they still, even though they are not working and they're not being productive in the labor force, they are still receiving economic benefit from the government for being unemployed. And so if you take away that economic benefit, there's going to be even more incentive to go out and look at jobs. So eliminating unemployment insurance, while not able to reduce frictional unemployment to zero, would definitely reduce frictional unemployment as well. It's not going to be B as well. C says it is inevitable because at any given time, jobs are being created in some firms and destroyed in other firms. And this is the right answer because not all firms are created equal. Some firms are going to be creating or destroying jobs, and people are going to be shuffling around between all these different firms. And so in that sense of things, frictional unemployment is always going to happen as people leave their old jobs and look for new jobs that are opening up. So that C is the big reason why frictional unemployment is inevitable. D says also inevitable because in some industries, wages are always set above the level that brings supply and demand into equilibrium. And so this is one of the reasons in which there would be unemployment when wages are set above equilibrium levels and there's a shortage of labor. But this is not going to be categorized as frictional unemployment. It's not something that is involved in a job search process. And in that sense, it is going to be a process that requires us to have certain, it's going to be more so the case for structural unemployment in that setting. And so, we're not going to consider that to be the answer here for number 7 for frictional unemployment. So the answer choice here is going to be C, inevitable, because at any given times, jobs are being created in some firms and destroyed in other firms. So this says C, inevitable, because at any given time, jobs are being created in some firms and destroyed in other firms. 8 says people who are unemployed because wages are for some reason set above the level that brings labor supply and demand into equilibrium are best classified as which of the following. And we just went over this in the last question, and we said people are going to be doing are going to have that labor supply and demand equilibrium as a result of structural unemployment, where because wages are above equilibrium, there's a shortage of labor, and that structure of the economy leads to there not being enough jobs to go around. And so this is one of the explanations that is given for why we see structural unemployment in the economy. And the other 2 main reasons that we are usually talking about are either unions or efficiency wages. So that's going to be important to note, and B is going to be the right answer for 8. And so B says structurally unemployed, and that is the correct answer here. 9 says the natural unemployment rate includes A, both frictional and structural unemployment, B, neither frictional nor structural unemployment, C, structural but not frictional, or D, frictional but not structural. So we talked about this in number 1, but natural unemployment rate includes frictional and structural, and then the actual rate is frictional and structural plus cyclical. So in this case, if we're just talking about natural, then it's going to be A, both frictional and structural unemployment are included. So A says both frictional and structural unemployment, which is great. And finally 10, frictional unemployment can be the consequence of A, workers leaving existing jobs to find ones they like better. B, one industry declining while another is growing. C, changes in the working conditions offered by competing firms. D, all of the above are correct. And so, this is again talking about the job search process. And again, all three of these are good reasons in which one worker would find, uh, frictional unemployment to be attractive because they're trying to find the best jobs that are suited to their interests and skills. And so we pick D here since all three of these seem to be good reasons that are falling under this category of looking for the best job that fulfills one's skills and preferences. So D says all of the above are correct, and 10 is right as well. So great. So we went over all 10 questions. The only one that we had an issue with was number 1. This idea of a classification of labor force and unemployment. And so we're going to mark this question as incorrect just to clarify that one question, but the other 9 questions are all right, and had the tutor was very accurate with those ones as well. So I'm just going to submit that one, and then we can take a look at the next question. So next question says, which of the following are automatic stabilizers? Check all that apply. In number 1, in response to the 2008 recession, Congress approved billions of dollars of additional spending on public infrastructure projects. Number 2, a corporate profits rise during economic expansion causes corporate income tax revenue to rise. Number 3, as people earn higher incomes during the expansion, the progressive tax system requires them to pay higher average tax rates. And number 4, in 1968, Congress enacted a temporary 10% increase in personal income taxes in response to an inflationary GDP gap. And so the question here is really asking us first, what is an automatic stabilizer? And so automatic stabilizers are policies that basically function as buffers for the economy to reduce any fluctuations in either direction. Either if the economy is growing too slowly, there would be an automatic stabilizer to kind of, keep the economy moving a little bit faster than it would otherwise. And on the other hand, if the economy is expanding too fast, an automatic stabilizer is going to, again, automatically reduce kind of the rate of growth for that economy in some way. And so this is really contrasted against discretionary policies. And so discretionary policies are policies in which Congress or some government body is reacting to some sort of scenario and going through a very pointed process of passing a policy in order to affect some kind of change. And so the big difference here is automatic versus discretionary. One is without any kind of process required, it automatically happens. And the other is it requires some sort of action by some sort of government party. So taking a look at these answer choices, we can classify each one as either yes, an automatic stabilizer, or no. So number 1 says in response to the 2008 recession. In that sense, we should already be thinking this is going to be discretionary because it's in response to a certain scenario. Congress approved billions of dollars of additional spending on public infrastructure projects. And so again, we would not call this an automatic stabilizer because it did not happen by itself. It required action by Congress in order to occur. And so it's not going to be what we consider an automatic stabilizer. Number 2 says when corporate profits rise during economic expansion, corporate income tax revenue rises. And so automatic stabilizer. So I think in some senses, yes, because when you so it depends on if the tax scales in the same way it doesn't for question 3, because if corporate profits rise during economic expansion, if the corporate income tax were to stay at this same flat rate, I'm not sure how that would necessarily slow down the economy, right? But if we were to say that as corporate profits rise during economic expansion and corporate income tax revenues were to scale automatically in the way that is currently structured, so that the profits are taxed at a higher rate as they increase, then that would be an example of an automatic stabilizer, because it is a existing structure that slows down the economy the more profits are. And so that would be one that I would hesitantly check depending on how corporate income tax is structured. 3 is one that I would definitely check as an automatic stabilizer. As people earn higher incomes during the expansion, the progressive tax system requires them to pay higher average tax rates. And so this is an example of where during a rapidly growing economy that is probably in an expansionary gap, the progressive tax system is going to effectively cause people to pay more of their money as a percentage in taxes, which would reduce the amount of disposable income they have to spend in the economy. And so that is something that would slow down the economy and would act as a buffer for in the event of an expansionary gap. And so number 3 is something that is an example of an automatic stabilizer. Number 4 says, in 1968, Congress enacted, and so again, we're thinking discretionary because Congress had to do something. So Congress enacted a temporary 10% increase in personal income tax rates in response to an inflationary GDP gap. And again, this is going to be discretionary, not automatic, and so we're not going to pick 4. So let's take a look at the answers given by the previous tutor. Number 1 says approval of billions of dollars spent on public expenditure is not an automatic stabilizer as it is being made by governments for specifically combating the recession. So it's not working automatically here. So yeah, that's a good answer. Number 2 says this is an example of the automatic stabilization. Corporate earnings increase during expansion and tax paid by the government also increase. On the other hand, during recession, earnings of corporations decrease and they start paying less taxes. So I want to add my addendum for that real quickly because I'm not sure if having a flat tax rate would really decrease, kind of slow down the economy. This depends a bit on the structure of the corporate tax rate, i.e. whether it's a flat tax or a progressive tax like income tax. If the tax were to be a flat tax, regardless of profit levels, it's not clear how this tax would act as a stabilizer to slow down the economy in the event of an expansionary gap. Merely having higher government tax revenue would not act as a buffer because it doesn't change the proportionate tax burden in the non-expansionary versus expansionary scenario. So that's kind of a clarification for number 2, just ensuring that, we don't want to mislead anybody and say that it's definitely the case that it's an automatic stabilizer. Number 3 says, it is also an example of an automatic stabilizer. People pay more taxes during the boom and less taxes during the recession. And so that is the case. Again, keeping in mind that it is not the amount of the tax that is necessarily the case, but the proportion of their income as tax. That is more so the case. And that is going to be more of the automatic stabilizer. And 4 says this is not an automatic stabilizer. During the inflation, people are subject to more tax to tame down inflationary pressure. So, I mean, it is not an automatic stabilizer. I don't think it has to do with I don't think this is an issue of whether or not they're subject to more tax. It's more so this is not an automatic stabilizer because it is a policy that required action by Congress, i.e. discretionary. And so that's going to be the reason. So We're not going to mark this as incorrect. I think the answers given are sufficient, but I think the explanations for 2 and 4 are a little bit off. So we're going to include our 2 addendums to this and make sure that this is fully answered in the answers choices. Okay, let's take a look at the next question. It says, which of the following payment types requires you to pay up front? One says money orders and credit cards. B says money orders and prepaid cards. C says merchant cards and credit cards. And D says merchant cards and prepaid cards. So this is just a definition question. So anything with credit cards is we know that we pay those at a later date. You're taking a quote unquote loan every time you purchase on a credit card, and so you pay that back at the end of the month. So 1 and 3 are eliminated, and then it goes between money orders and merchant cards. And so money orders are again a prepaid form of a money order is a prepaid form of a card, whereas a merchant card is kind of can include either money order or credit cards. And so money order is only going to be only one that requires that kind of upfront payment, the same way like a debit card requires, and that's why 2 would be the right answer here. So let's take a look at the answer choices. 2 money orders and prepaid cards, which is correct, and then they give a definition of all the types of payments that are defined in this question. Money order is a payment order that is one of the most trusted forms of payments, as it requires a specific amount to be prepaid. It was introduced by a private firm, but became popular after its acquisition by another firm in 1836. The system was taken over by the post office in 1838. A credit card does not require an upfront payment, as a credit card transaction creates a liability in the name of the owner of the card that shall be paid within the specific time period along with interest. So yeah, that is a credit card. And C says a merchant allows payment receipts by both credit and debit. A merchant account allows payment receipts by both credit and debit cards. It's generally used by businesses. And so we're going to, just keep in mind for number 2, money orders and prepaid cards as the definitional correct answers. So good explanation of the options. And mark that as correct. Let's go to the next question. So next question talks about utility, I believe. It says marginal utility can A, be positive or negative but not zero, B, decrease but not become negative, C, increase positively but not negatively, or B, or D, be positive, negative, or zero. So in this sense, we would say that marginal utility can be positive, negative, or zero. Is in almost all cases positive until you reach a level of consumption in which you get zero marginal utility, in which you would stop consuming a good, and then negative marginal utility refers to that scenario where actually further consuming a good is going to actually decrease the amount of enjoyment you have. You can think of consuming something like Coke, where at the 20th Coke you finally have had enough, and you gain no enjoyment from the next Coke, and so that's when your marginal utility is zero, and the 21st Coke is so much that it makes you throw up, and that gives you negative marginal utility. And so marginal utility can span the spectrum in terms of positive, negative, or zero. So let's take a look at the previous year's answers, and they said they bolded and italicized the option, and be positive, negative, or zero is the right answer here, so great. Next question says, economists are able to determine total utility by doing which of the following: multiplying marginal utility of the last unit consumed by the unit price, multiply the marginal utility of the first unit consumed by the number of units consumed, multiply the marginal utility of the last unit consumed by the number of units consumed, summing out the marginal utilities of each unit consumed. So marginal utility fluctuates according to a diminishing law of marginal utility by every single unit that you're consuming. And so we would not be multiplying anything by the number of units, because that assumes a consistent marginal utility. And what we're really thinking about in terms of total utility is going to be this last option, summing up the marginal utilities of each unit that was consumed. And so we're going to be picking that as the right answer here. So summing up the marginal utilities of each unit consumed is the right answer. So that's great. And then third question says, how does the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics gain information with regard to the typical consumption choices of Americans? And so this is a definition-based question or a fact-based question. And so we have consumer spending survey, consumer income survey, consumer expenditure survey, consumer income budget survey. And so just from the lessons that you guys have had, it would be a consumer expenditure survey. That would be the right one here for the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics about consumption. So let's take a look at the answers and say, yep, Consumer Expenditure Survey, and that would be the right answer. And then the last, I don't think this is a full question, so I think the question cut off here. So I think the tutor did a great job noting the right answers here. I'm gonna, note everything is correct. Oh, it looks like they have a lot more here, so I guess it got cut off when we were talking about the previous question. Okay, so detailed solutions. Okay, so let's take a look at this next question. It says, an improvement in production technology will do which of the following? And so it says, A, shift the supply curve to the right, B, shift the supply curve to the left, C, shift the demand curve to the left, or D, increase the equilibrium price. And so the direct consequence of improving production technology is essentially to allow suppliers to produce more of the same good, produce more a higher quantity of the same good given the same amount of resources. And so if we think about this, that means that every single price, the supplier can produce more. And so that's going to effectively shift the supply curve to the right? And so, that is a direct impact of production technology. And we know it's not going to affect the demand curve because production technology is on the supply side. And so that might be the answer. And an increased equilibrium price, we know that if the supply curve shifts to the right on a supply and demand curve, we can quickly draw this out. Oops, I think this turned off maybe. We can take a look at on the right hand side. If we have our supply and demand curve, a rightward shift in supply leads us to have a lower decrease in price on the y-axis because we have an original equilibrium point here that transitions to a second equilibrium point down here, and so that's going to actually cause a decreased equilibrium price rather than an increase. So we know that number one is going to be the right answer here. Improvement in production technology will shift the supply curve to the right. And so let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers, and they say, yep, it shifts the supply curve to the right. An improvement in production technology is likely to enhance the productivity of inputs that are involved in the production process. The advancement may free up resources to be used elsewhere or in the same process to produce a greater amount of output, or may increase the efficiency or productivity of the human and or physical capital involved in production. An advancement may also allow substitution from a depleting natural resource stock that is expensive to a human-made substitute. Collectively or individually, the consequences of an improvement in production technology will shift the supply curve to the right as supply increases. So yeah, I think that's a very good explanation, great explanation. And I don't think there's anything we need to really add there. I think that really covers the things we need to know for this question. So the next question says, which of the following is not held constant along a given demand curve for a good? A, price, B, consumer income, C, the price of substitutes, or D, consumer tastes. And so when we're talking about a demand curve, right, it depicts the relationship. We'll draw this again. It depicts the relationship between price and quantity, right? And so in terms of what is not being held constant, the only thing that fluctuates along the demand curve is going to be price, right? Everything else, we assume like consumer income, substitute price, or consumer tastes, those are determinants of demand. And so if those things were to change, then we would see shifts in the demand curve either to the left or to the right? And so we're not going to see that being the case when we have a stagnant demand curve. And so the only thing that is not held constant is going to be price. As you move along the demand curve, you can see that price is going to be fluctuating, high price on the left side and lower price on the right side. And so the correct answer here is going to be price. And so we can take a look at the previous tutor's answers, and they say, along a given demand curve, factors affecting demand other than prices are held constant. These factors affecting demand other than price are price of related goods. income of consumers, taste and preferences, numbers of consumers in the market, etc. Thus, along the demand curve, only price remains non-constant, while all other factors affecting demand are taken as constant. So yeah, the same conversation we had about the difference between determinants of demand and price. So that's going to be the right answer. And finally, number 2, decreasing price will A, decrease demand, B, decrease supply, C, cause a shortage, or D, both A and B. And so, the right answer here is that if you decrease price, what's going to happen on the demand side is that you're going to have an increase in quantity demanded, right? On the supply side, if you had a decrease in price, you will have a decrease in supply, so quantity supplied, right? People are less likely to supply if the price is low. So it looks like both A and B, but again, I really want to clarify that normally when we're talking about increase in demand, that refers to a shift in demand. When we want to talk about quantity, we would specify will increase quantity demanded and will decrease quantity supplied. And so that distinction between quantity demanded versus overall demand is really important. So I think this phrasing of this question is a little bit misleading in that will increase demand usually implies a shift, but in this case, I think they're referring to a increase in quantity demanded or a shift along the curve, rather a shift of the entire curve. So the answer choice here would be both A and B. So I think the previous tutor did not answer this question, so we'll just insert a question here. And so we say number 2, D is the correct answer. Decreasing price will increase quantity demanded as given by the law of demand, while decreasing price will also increase or decrease quantity supplied as given by the law of supply. And so note that the phrase that the answer choices should have been more accurately written as increasing the quantity demanded and decreasing the quantity supplied. And that should be the correct answer here. And so that would be the answer to the next choice, the last question, both A and B. And so we're going to submit that as correct, though. So the next question says, what is a marginal seller and a marginal buyer? So this goes on the idea of economics of thinking on the margin. And so what we're really thinking here is who is, for a marginal seller, who is the last seller who is willing to sell at this price, right? Who's barely willing to sell because they basically earn no producer surplus from selling this good. And on the buyer side, who is the last person to buy, the least willing person to buy this good at this price, who's still buying the good? And that's the person who, again, earns no consumer surplus from buying this good because the current price is his exact willingness to pay. And so everybody else who's buying might be willing to pay more, but this marginal buyer is the last person who entered the consumption kind of market here at this price point. So that's kind of what the marginal seller and marginal buyer refer to. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. And they said a marginal buyer and a marginal seller are those who barely stay in the market, which is good. A marginal seller is a seller who is willing to sell his goods at a price equal to its economic cost and does not earn producer surplus, right? And that's what we talked about as this guy who just barely is selling and he doesn't earn any benefit at all. If the price becomes lower, the marginal seller will leave the market. For example, a marginal seller sells at a minimum selling price of 2. Anything lower than that will drive him out of the market. Meanwhile, a marginal buyer is the one whose maximum buying price is just 2, and anything higher than that will drive him out of the market, right? So again, just these thinking on the margin, it's the same thing as any other time we see the word margin. Just the last person on the very kind of cusp of leaving the market due to if the price were to change in either direction. So, great answer. I'm going to mark that as correct. The next question says, long-run GDP growth is determined by which of the following? And so it says long run GDP growth is basically how much GDP grows per year. And so that's going to be a function of all the elements that make up productivity. And so there's going to be labor productivity, there's going to be how large the labor force is, there's going to be the investment in capital that is available, both human capital as well as physical capital. And then there's going to be technology, which is basically how do we assemble all of those factors of GDP, products of labor, of human capital, of physical capital, etc. How do we put that all together in order to create actual output? And so technology is going to be one of those kind of multiplier effect variables. And so those are the things we're looking at when we really talk about growth in GDP and a function of that. And so any change in the resource stock that you have or productivity or change in technology is going to cause there to be increased growth. And the opposite would be true as well. Any decrease would lead to a decrease in growth. So let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. They said the long-run economic growth of a GDP of a country is determined by its capital stock, right? Labor force participation, labor productivity, and technology. So there's also like human capital and stuff like that. But yeah, this is good. They said the sustained increase in the quantity of goods and services produced in the economy is described as long-run growth. The ratio of economic output with respect to the quantity of inputs available, namely capital, labor, energy, and raw materials, the labor force participation rate, the available technology, and the productivity of labor determines the growth of an economy. Yeah, and so that's really a good answer. Very thorough. It incorporates all of the elements that are contributing to long-run GDP growth. Great. Includes all the elements of long-run GDP growth. So let's take a look at this next question. It says, consider a demand curve illustrated in the figure to the right. Is demand elastic or inelastic? It says A, demand is elastic at all prices above $9 and inelastic at all prices below $9. B, demand is elastic at all prices above $7 and inelastic at all prices below $7. C, demand is elastic at all prices. D, demand is inelastic at all prices above 9, inelastic at all prices below 9. E, demand is inelastic at all prices. And it also asks at what price is total revenue maximized. And so this is the graph at hand. It looks fairly small. We're going to see if we can open it up and zoom in a little bit. Nope, we can't. Let's see if that works. So the first question is this demand curve elastic or inelastic? And so it's important to note that all demand curves have regions of elasticity and inelasticity and unit elasticity. It's going to be unit elastic right in the middle. So if we take the x-intercept is at 9, so 4.5 is going to be the point at which it's unit elastic. And so for anything above that point, because we're talking about percentage change, not absolute change, anything above $9 is going to be considered elastic, whereas anything below $9 is going to be considered inelastic. And to see that, all you have to do is look at the equation for elasticity. We were just talking about that here, where percentage change in quantity divided by percentage change in price. When you already have high quantity, then a change from like 5 to 6, let's say, is only a 20% change, whereas a change from 1 to 2 is a 100% change in quantity, right? So when you already have high quantity, then elasticity is going to be lower, and that's why it's inelastic after the halfway point. And then the other sense, elasticity, when you have a lower quantity demanded, that's going to lead to a more elastic demand because the initial elasticity is very high at low quantities. And so we're going to say that A is correct. Demand is elastic at all prices above $9. $9 is the price at 4.5 units, right? $9. And so any point above that is going to be elastic, and at any point below $9 is going to be inelastic. And then it asks us at what price is total revenue maximized. And so total revenue is maximized. And so what we would basically want to do is multiply out price times quantity for every single point along this graph. So we can do that really quickly. We can do at 0, it's 0 over here. At 1, it's $16. At 2, it's $28. At 3, it's $36. At 4, it's $40. At 5, it's $40. So at 4 we had 40, at 5 we had 40, and so we're going to assume that the price is going to be maximized at either production of 4 or 5, because we go to 6, then we only get 36. So we peaked at $40 as total revenue. So at what price is total revenue maximized? Either when price is equal to 10 or 8. If you could sell, I guess, half units, then you get 4.5 times 9, which I believe is going to be 40.5. So that would be the peak. But if you can't sell half units, then it would be either 10 or 8. But 9 is going to be the closest we can get if we can sell half units. So that is the total revenue maximization. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers. It said A, demand is elastic at all prices above 9 and inelastic at all prices below 9. So this is the same as we said. And so, we said when demand is elastic, then increase in price leads to a decrease in total revenue. When demand is inelastic, increases in price leads to an increase in total revenue. So that total revenue is maximized when the price equals $9. Right, so this is, again, a very good thing to point out. The previous tutor did that I should also touch on is the relationship between elasticity and total revenue. And so they note that there's this case where when demand is elastic, then increasing price increases total revenue. And the reason that that's the case is what we're saying when demand is elastic is that quantity demanded is relatively more responsive than we would expect to price changes. So if we increase the price at all when it's elastic, we're going to find a disproportionate drop in the quantity demanded, which leads to total revenue dropping. Because again, total revenue is equal to price times quantity. So when the demand is elastic, what we should be doing is decreasing the price. Because even though by decreasing the price, we decrease the amount of money that we can bring in for each good, the elastic demand means that the reduction in price is compensated by more than proportional increases in quantity demanded, which would overall increase the total revenue. And so when demand is elastic, we should be dropping prices. So essentially, if the portion above $9 is elastic, then we should be dropping prices until it's $9. And then for when demand is inelastic, increasing prices increases total revenue. The reason that has the case is because what we're saying in that sense is that quantity demanded is relatively less responsive to increases in prices. So even though, yes, by increasing prices, you're going to lose a certain amount of quantity demanded and losing sales, the loss in sales as a percentage is less than the percentage increase in the amount of money you make on each good. And so that offset of higher prices for a little bit lower quantity demanded is going to cause there to be an increase in total revenue. And so that's the way we can think of it. So any region in which the price is below $9, we know we can make more money by increasing the price to $9. And so that would be the point in time where it's unit elastic and there's the no incentive to be deviating away from that point. And so that would give us $9 times 4.5 is $40.5 for the maximization. And that, again, that is answered. Again, we didn't have to go through this process of multiplying out each quantity, even though we could. We didn't have to do that because we already know that unit elastic price is where profit maximization occurs for a firm which has elastic and inelastic portions of the demand curve. So yeah, so great answer. And again, they also did the graph here, so this is very thorough. I'm going to say great answer. Good job pointing out the link between elasticity and profit maximization. Correct the prefix, profit maximization. So yeah, that's going to be correct as well. So the next question says, which equation represents the relationship between GDP and the 4 major expenditure components? So we're going to write that out as let me see if I can insert a text box. So GDP is equal to, or Y is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So this is the expenditure approach to calculating GDP. And so C represents consumption, I is investment, G is government spending, net exports is exports minus imports. And so if we add up all these things together, and these are the expenditure components for GDP. Let's take a look at the answer choice given by the tutor. So yep, GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. This is a very straightforward, just kind of recall question. And so the tutor goes on to explain that GDP is the aggregate of the market value of all final goods and services produced within the domestic borders of an economy in a given period of time, most often in a year. It can be presented as a sum of consumption expenditure C, gross investment I, government expenditure G, and net exports NX, where net exports are the difference between the exports and imports of a country. And GDP is a representation of the economic activity of a nation. And yep, this is great. Very straightforward. Great, very straightforward answer. Yeah, I don't think there's many bells and whistles with this one. This is very just recall. So the next question says, suppose that society decides to reduce consumption and increase investment. How would this change affect economic growth? What groups in society would benefit from this change, and what groups might be hurt? And so the first thing that we have to know is this: when we talk about consumption versus investment in terms of growth, what you're really talking about is current versus future period. Where consumption is going to benefit you in the current period, and investment is going to hurt you in the current period because you're taking away from consumption, but it's going to benefit you in the future period because investment leads to higher growth. And so if we were to reduce consumption and increase investment, that would affect economic growth by increasing economic growth due to higher investment, right? You can think of investing more in college education, investing more in physical capital, and stuff like that. And so that is going to be the effect. And then finally, what groups in society would benefit from this change and what groups might be hurt. And so you could think of who would benefit from a higher economic growth rate in the future. You can think of younger people who would still be alive in the future and therefore would reap the benefits of economic growth, whereas older people who might not be alive when the future period of economic growth occurs, they might be hurt from this change because there's less consumption in the current period. So let's take a look at the answers given by the previous tutor. So A says it leads to an increase in economic growth, increase in investment results in capital accumulation. Capital accumulation leads to an increase in productivity of the economy and eventually increases economic growth. However, to increase investment, that will occur at the cost of current consumption. Thus, greater investments would lead to greater economic growth. So yeah, that's the relationship. More investment is more growth. And B says, the result would be that there would be large amounts of savings and investments. The present savings and investments would benefit future generations from the decision to reduce consumption and increase investment. Therefore, the present generation will get hurt. It's because the investment can be increased only at the cost of current consumption. Furthermore, due to increased productivity and economic growth, there will be an increase in standard of living for the economy. Thus, an increased investment spending can decrease current consumption, however, it increases the standard of living for future generations. So I think, again, this touches upon, the economy of the people who benefit from future growth versus people who are hurt from from current investment. And so that is, again, the same relationship that we talked about before. So correct in both counts. So great, good answer. Correct for both. Great. The next question says, the budget line shows the boundary between those combinations of goods and services that A, have positive marginal utility and those that have negative marginal utility, B, are available and those that are unavailable, C, are desirable and those that are undesirable, D says affordable and those that are unaffordable, and E says normal goods and those that are inferior goods. And so a budget line, we can draw out one real quick. Let me see if we can use a shape instead. So we'll do the y-axis, the x-axis. Whoops. We have our x-axis. This is pretty laggy. And then we have our budget line. And so the budget line is just a straight line. And the way we usually see this occurring is in a two goods model where you have good x on the x-axis and good y on the y-axis. And what the consumption, what the budget line is basically saying is that these are all the possible bundles of goods you can have between these two goods that you are buying, given your budget. And so if we spend all of our money on good Y, we could buy this much of good Y. If we spend all of our money on good X, we could buy this much of good X. And we can buy combinations of good X and Y across the spectrum. Anything within the budget line is possible. It just means that we aren't spending all of our money, and we are not, we could buy more by consuming on the line. Anything outside the line is impossible. We simply do not have enough money in our budget to purchase that much of each of these goods. And so we can have to either, if we wanted this much, for example, we wanted this much of good X, then we can only have 0 of good Y. We cannot have this much of good X and this much of good Y. And so this really is a limit between what is possible and impossible, or affordable or unaffordable. And so that goes along the lines of D. The budget line shows the boundary between those combinations of goods and services that are affordable and those that are unaffordable. And so I think having that understanding is good to understand. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. They said the correct answer is D. The budget line shows all possible combinations of two goods that can be purchased given the consumer's income constraint. All points above the budget line are unaffordable to the consumer as it is more than the consumer's income. All points along the budget line is affordable and uses all of the consumer's income. All points below the budget line is affordable and does not use all of the consumer's income. And I think that's a great answer, right? So this is a great answer. Very thorough explanation. And yeah, so they hit the nail on the head with this one. Explained all 3 regions of the graph just like I did, and kind of that's what you have to understand when looking at a budget line. So we're going to say that's correct, and looks like that wraps up all the questions we had marked out for today. So hopefully that was helpful, guys. Covered some of the commonly asked questions about micro and macro, and this will all be posted online. And other than that, hope everybody's still doing well and staying safe, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.